Let's get smarter with the help of our lead off panel. MS Now Capitol Hill reporter Kevin Fry is here. Laura Barone Lopez, White House reporter, also for MS Now. Peter Baker, chief White House correspondent for the New York Times. And Dave Weigel is here, political reporter for Semafor. Okay, Peter, North Carolina is set to send out its mail-in ballots next week. It seems like there is no way these changes can happen before the midterms. Is the goal just let's create more chaos before the election?
Yeah, I was at the post office this week, and I have to say, I did not give a lot of faith that there's going to be an efficient management of this. I have to say that most Americans, I don't think the post office is the best run organization in the government. And so I think you're right. It does create a great deal of uncertainty among voters. A lot of voters are going to wonder whether or not their mail-in ballots will be valid if they do try to use mail-in ballots. But I think, the point that you made, citing Ben Ginsburg, the longtime Republican election attorney, is a good one, which is that Republicans vote by mail just like Democrats do. And in a lot of places, that's actually to the party's benefit, because voters who are less likely to turn out at the polls, in some cases, vote Republican. So it could be a self-destructive thing. And if anybody out there is worried that mail-in voting is wrong, it may be Republicans who hear the president telling them that. And if you simply depress the Republican vote for mail-in voting, even by a few percent, it could make a difference in a lot of these close races. So a lot of Republican officials are very worried about president's actions here. But I think you're right. It's not necessarily even to affect this election. We'll see. Maybe it will go forward. But it is about laying a predicate to claim the election is unfair and rigged, as he likes to say, if it doesn't go his way.
Laura, you have been talking to state election officials on the front lines. What are they telling you?
Yeah, so I've also been talking to a Republican top election official in Utah who said that if this ultimately is allowed to proceed, yes, they cleared the way for it to, but a lot of the election officials believe that this will get halted in the coming days, that this will fully get blocked, and for at least 2026. But what that Utah Lieutenant Governor Deirdre Henderson told me is that if somehow this were to proceed and the president were to get his way, that it would inject chaos, that it is not possible for them to comply at this point, that it just wouldn't work. They wouldn't be able to do it. And so she's hopeful that more states, like Republican-led states like Utah, she said, will fight the administration on this, because she views this not as just a 2026 battle, but as one that goes beyond 2026. Because even if it is halted for 2026, the administration is going to continue to pursue things like this or try to find other workarounds, because the president, as all of us know, has said over and over again that he absolutely wants to ban mail ballots. He doesn't just want to restrict the delivery of them, which is what this rule would do if it takes effect. He wants to actually get rid of them wholesale. And just to hammer the point home that Peter and you were making, Steph, Deirdre Henderson, that lieutenant governor, said Utah has been voting by mail for years, and it is still a Republican state. So, again, these are Republican voters, older voters, elderly voters, rural voters who are going to be impacted if something like this were ever to take effect.
Dave, weigh in on this very point that we have all been making. Think about older voters, rural voters, white, rural, older voters. You know what they are? Trump voters. Why does he want to do this?
Part of what he's doing is giving them a story, the Trump voters, older voters, that they agree with already, that and the larger idea is gets them excited about voting in the midterm. The president wants a conversation to be about the Save America Act. It wants it to be about the threat to our elections. The way that Democrats are interpreting this, and Laura set it up very well, is that they do think they'll litigate successfully that this cannot be done in time for these midterms. They're not worried about that. What they are seeing is Republicans being told once again that these elections will not be fair, and there will be a pretext to challenge the elections if Republicans do poorly. Texas is the one I hear most about. The Democrats are a little bit worried that if they eke out elections in Texas, this would include House races in the Rio Grande Valley. Republicans are creating a pretext to say that was stolen somehow. The legal battle is somewhat complicated here. the story is not complicated. It's the president telling his base that he is right and they are right. And if they see mail-in ballots going for Democrats, that is because Democrats are trying to steal the election. More complicated than that. But every day that he's talking about this, his favorite issue is one that he thinks he's waking up the base. I expect to hear more about it at the Republican midterm convention in 2 weeks.
Waking them up to do what, though? I want to know, Kevin, Republicans that are running in these midterms, especially in purple states, what do they say about this?
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, there is a realization, I think, amongst Republicans that obviously they don't want to end the ability to do mail-in voting, just because it is something, of course, that would benefit, as has been laid out by the panel. But I also want to add to this conversation that Trump, of course, also himself votes by mail. And so there's this incongruity that is going on between what is being said publicly and what is going on necessarily with what his own actions are. And then, of course, there is, as you mentioned, this fear right now for Republicans that obviously a lot of the issues that they hope to be running on this cycle have been kind of wiped away, including obviously economic news, the tax cuts, et cetera, that were part of the big bill from last year. And so now they are kind of struggling once already to galvanize their base for a variety of reasons. This adds another round of confusion and potential difficulty to getting the votes they need lined up as they head into these midterms.
Okay, so what would it actually look like, Laura? Okay, so like if the order goes into effect, what could happen if somebody shows up to vote and they're not on the list of eligible voters? And why wouldn't they be on the list?
Yeah, so there's a lot of lists that that President Trump wants. He wants to create state citizenship lists. He wants, under this order, what would happen is that states would be compelled to hand over the list of voters that they have said are going to receive mail ballots or absentee ballots, and that they hand over that list to the Postal Service. The Postal Service reviews it, references the data that they have, and then sends the ballots to the list of voters that they deem eligible to have those mail ballots. But again, the Postmaster General of the U.S. Postal Service and the rule itself states that if states don't hand over that voter data, which states like Utah don't want to hand over that voter data, and a lot of Democratic states don't want to have to hand over that voter data on who they say they would give mail ballots to, who they've deemed eligible for mail ballots. The Postmaster General said, if you don't hand over that voter data, we are not going to deliver those mail ballots. So that is what this rule would do. It also, if the executive order is fully in effect, allows the Department of Homeland Security to create a citizenship list. And one thing that we are not getting real answers on from the administration, and I've asked the DHS and I've asked the Postal Service, is what's the level of data sharing going on across these agencies, which is that citizenship list that DHS is creating, where they're also creating lists of who they say are non-citizens on these voter rolls. They're alleged non-citizens. Again, the math isn't adding up when they're creating those lists so far, based on the election officials we've talked to and based on what DHS has said in meetings. But what kind of data sharing is going on? And they won't answer that question, which is, will DHS share the citizenship list with the Postal Service? Will Postal Service share the list of mail ballot voters that they have with DHS or with Justice Department? Because again, looming over all of this is the potential for law enforcement to charge election officials if they think they've done something wrong.
And all of this, among other things, is making people angrier and angrier. Peter, you wrote about how both home and abroad we are seeing more defiance of Trump instead of deference. What's changed?
Yeah, I think, when we saw Trump come back to office last year, the initial reaction by a lot of institutions inside the country and foreign leaders outside the country was to defer to him, whether it be law firms, universities, employers, media outlets, tech billionaires. They were all either signing settlements or sending money to him or what have you. And foreign leaders were quick to say, yes, we're going to, in NATO's case, increase our spending the way the president wants us to. Well, a year later, I think what we see is a different atmosphere. It doesn't mean that the president isn't still the dominant figure in American society. He is. But you see more institutions saying, no, I'm not so sure I'm going to go along with that. Case in point, obviously, Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, not going along with the trade deal the president tried to force on him, even at the risk of this crippling tariff war that he's now facing. Domestically, ABC, the television network, which gave Trump $16 billion as a settlement early on, maybe thinking it was buying a little bit of peace, discovered it didn't, and now is suing the administration for trying to illegally, in its view, pressure its broadcast licenses. So I think that there's more of a willingness to challenge him. Now, there are exceptions, obviously. Capitol Hill Republicans being a prominent one. Todd Blanche was confirmed, despite the misgivings of quite a number of Republican senators. So, there are limits to this, but it's not the same as it was a year ago.